The gun was already pressed against the back of Clement Thatcher's neck before Theodora Dawson even realized she had pulled it. Her hand was shaking. The barrel of the Colt was shaking. The dry Arizona wind cut across the open stable yard of the Holloway Ranch and sent a curtain of red dust spinning between them. And still she could not lower the weapon, because the man standing 3 feet away from her with his hands half raised and his gray eyes absolutely steady was the same man who had, just 40 minutes ago, saddled 2 horses without being asked, handed her the reins of the second animal, and said, "You will need someone who knows the canyon passes." She had thought he was helping her. She had thought for one breathless and forbidden moment that someone in this God-forsaken territory had chosen her side without wanting something in return. Then she had found the letter folded into the saddlebag. It was written in the hand of Marshal Dale Vickers of Prescott, Arizona Territory, dated 4 days prior, and it bore Clement Thatcher's name at the top. The words that burned through her vision now like a brand were these: "Detain the Dawson woman at any cost. Her testimony can unravel 3 years of careful work. Do not let her reach Tucson. Betrayal." The word sat in the center of her chest like a rifle ball lodged too deep to pull free. "Put it down, Theodora," Clement said. His voice was low, not frightened, not aggressive, just low the way a man spoke to a horse that had shied at something in the dark. "You were going to detain me," she said. "You saddled that second horse so you could follow me into the canyon and detain me." "I saddled that second horse so that you would not die alone in Sycamore Canyon with a broken ankle and no water," he said, "which is exactly what would have happened, and you know it." The letter. Read the whole letter, Theodora. She had not read the whole letter. She had read those 2 incriminating lines and felt the world cave in under her boots, and she had drawn the gun, and here they were. The horses shifted behind her, both of them, the bay gelding she had asked to borrow and the buckskin stallion Clement had saddled for himself, their hooves sounding soft and restless against the packed earth. Somewhere beyond the stable wall, a rooster crowed with idiotic optimism. "Read the rest of it," Clement said again, still steady, still looking at her as though she were not pointing a firearm at the center of his chest. "Page 2, bottom paragraph." Her left hand found the second page. Her eyes moved against her own will. "The Dawson woman is the only honest witness left in Maricopa County. Whatever Vickers orders, protect her first. She carries secrets that could bring down half the territorial government. I am sorry to ask this of you, son. W.T. William Thatcher, his father." The gun lowered 1 inch, then 2. "Your father sent you to protect me," she said, "and it was not a question." "From the very beginning," Clement said, and his hands came slowly down. This is where the story truly started. 3 weeks and 200 miles to the east, in a dying town called Red Rock Junction, where Theodora Dawson had walked into the one general store still operating on the main street and discovered that the last stagecoach west had left without her. Red Rock Junction sat on the eastern edge of the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1882, a town that had briefly thrived on silver speculation and was now contracting around its own emptiness like a wound closing badly. The false-fronted buildings still wore their paint with some dignity, but the feed store had nailed its windows shut, the hotel had halved its rooms, and the barber operated out of what had once been a saloon, because the saloon had been sold to a cattle company that used it to store saddles. The population had dwindled from nearly 400 souls to something closer to 150, most of them ranchers and their families, men with leather-dark skin and women who moved through their days with the particular efficient grace of people who had long since stopped waiting for circumstances to improve. Theodora Dawson was 26 years old, and she had not been born to this land. She had come to it 8 years ago with her parents, who had believed, as so many had, that the territory offered something the Ohio Valley could not. Her father had tried farming, then cattle, then a small freighting business that had done reasonably well until the spring of 1880, when he had witnessed something he was never supposed to see. Marshal Dale Vickers of Prescott, accepting a payment of $12,000 in federal land grant money from a man named Conrad Holt, whose cattle company had been systematically stealing water rights from small ranchers across the Yavapai and Maricopa counties for 2 years. Jeremiah Dawson had written down what he saw. He had been careful. He had told only his wife and his daughter, and he had sent a letter to the territorial governor's office in Prescott. The letter had arrived. Someone in that office had sent a copy to Vickers. Jeremiah Dawson had died 6 weeks later in what was called a riding accident on the Black Canyon Road, though his horse was found uninjured, and the condition of his body suggested something far darker. Eleanor Dawson had followed him to the grave by winter, taken by a grief that wore the face of pneumonia. Theodora had been alone since then. She had kept her father's written account hidden, moved from town to town taking work where she could find it, taught children their letters in 2 different settlements, worked a kitchen in a 3rd, and tried to build a life out of the particular raw material of survival. She had not forgotten what she knew. She had not forgotten what her father had seen. And 2 months ago, a letter had come to her under a false name, routed through 3 different post offices, from a man who identified himself only as a federal investigator named Thomas Reed, who had been building a case against Marshal Vickers for 18 months. He needed her father's written account. He needed her testimony. He needed her in Tucson before the end of August, because a federal grand jury was being convened and the window was narrow, and if it closed without her evidence, Vickers and Holt would walk free and continue what they were doing, and more families would be destroyed. She had agreed. She had packed a single bag, a worn leather satchel that contained her father's document wrapped in oilcloth, 3 changes of clothes, her mother's small Bible, and $31 in mixed currency. She had made her way west by stages and hitched wagon rides, and on foot when those options failed. And she had arrived in Red Rock Junction 4 days behind schedule because of a washed-out bridge on the Salt River Road, and a bout of fever that had kept her flat on her back for 5 days in a widow's spare room in a place called Apache Wells. She stood in the doorway of the Red Rock Junction General Store in the August heat, and the storekeeper, a broad woman named Mrs. Peabody, who clearly prided herself on plain speaking, told her that the westbound stage had gone that morning and would not return for another 9 days, and that the next one after that ran directly to Tucson. 9 days. The grand jury convened in 16. The distance to Tucson was 190 miles. Theodora did the arithmetic in her head and felt the particular cold sensation of a plan beginning to fail. "Is there anyone in this town who might have a horse they would be willing to rent?" she asked. "Or sell, if the price is right?" Mrs. Peabody gave her the look of a woman who had answered variations of this question many times before. "You might try the Holloway Ranch, about 3 miles south on the main road. They keep stock. And there's Thatcher's place half a mile east of here, though Clement Thatcher is a private man and he is not in the habit of renting animals. But he has horses. He has several excellent ones, yes. The best in the county, some would say. He runs the Thatcher Cattle Company, or what is left of it now that Conrad Holt's people have been cutting him off from the northern range water." Mrs. Peabody paused and seemed to consider whether she had said too much. Then she apparently decided she had not. His father founded this valley, more or less. His father was a federal man, investigator of some kind, retired now and very ill up in Flagstaff. Clement has been managing things alone for 2 years. Theodora filed the name Conrad Holt away with a particular kind of attention. She thanked Mrs. Peabody, bought a small amount of jerked beef and 2 apples, and walked east toward the Thatcher place. It was a working ranch, clearly, but one that had suffered recently. The fence posts along the road were in good repair, and the buildings were solid and well-maintained, but 2 of the pastures she could see from the road were empty where they had likely once held cattle, and there was a quality of reduction about the place, as though something that had been larger was slowly being pressed smaller by an outside force. She saw the man before she reached the gate. He was in the yard beside the stable, working on a section of harness with a needle and wax thread, sitting on an upturned barrel with a focus that suggested either deep concentration or a very deliberate intention to ignore the world. He was perhaps 30, possibly a year or two more, lean and long-limbed the way men who worked hard outdoors tended to be, with dark brown hair that had gone a little long at the collar and the kind of sun-weathered face that recorded years of weather faithfully. He wore a plain blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, dust-gray trousers, and boots that had seen serious use. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his eyes were that distinctive cool gray, and he looked at her with the steady, measuring quality of someone who did not make quick assessments but intended to make accurate ones. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, "that's me. My name is Theodora Dawson. I am passing through Red Rock Junction on my way to Tucson, and I have missed the stage. I need to reach Tucson in 12 days. Mrs. Peabody at the general store told me you might be willing to rent a horse." He was quiet for a moment, not unfriendly, not rude, just quiet in the way that people were quiet when they were actually thinking instead of simply waiting for a pause to speak into. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "East. Apache Wells most recently." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just a small realignment around the eyes. "Alone?" he asked. "Yes. Going to Tucson for what purpose?" "Personal business," she said, because it was true and because she had learned long ago that details were expensive. He set the harness down on his knee and looked at her steadily. The August sun was enormous and generous and cruel all at once, and she stood in it without flinching, because she was beyond the point where physical discomfort rated highly on her scale of concerns. "I have a bay gelding I can rent," he said. "Good animal, steady over rough ground, no bad habits. $15 for the trip, on the condition that you leave him at the Tucson livery on Congress Street and send me a telegraph once he is settled." "That is fair," she said. "You will need to provision for at least 6 days. The direct road has 2 difficult sections. You are planning to ride alone." "I am." He looked at her for another of those long, quiet moments. "All right," he said. "Come inside and we will settle the paperwork." She followed him into the small ranch office off the main house's front room, where he had a wooden desk covered in neatly organized papers and a small iron stove that was unlit in the August heat. He wrote out a simple rental agreement with a steady hand, and she paid him $15 from her dwindling supply. He gave her a receipt. The whole transaction was businesslike and clean, and she was grateful for that, because she had encountered enough men in the past 2 years who had treated her solitude as either a mystery to be solved or an invitation to be accepted. This man treated it as simply a fact, like the weather or the state of the road. She was preparing to leave the office and go inspect the bay gelding when he said, without turning from the cabinet where he was filing her receipt, "There is a section of Sycamore Canyon about 40 miles west of here, where the main trail narrows to a ledge over a drop of about 60 feet. It has rained in the last week, and the rock will still be slick. Without a guide, a lone rider unfamiliar with the route will be in serious danger. I have maps," she said. "Maps do not show you where the loose rock is, or where the trail forks badly and the less traveled branch goes nowhere useful." He closed the cabinet and turned. "I will show you the provisioning list. It is longer than you are probably planning for." She did not argue about the provisioning list because he was right, and she could tell he was right from the economical and specific nature of every item on it, the kind of list written by someone who had survived on it rather than someone theorizing about survival. She spent the night at the Holloway Ranch, which Mrs. Peabody had pointed her toward, and which turned out to be a large, bustling household operated by a widow named Agnes Holloway and her 3 grown sons, who were loud and well-meaning and put her in a clean room with a real bed, and charged her $2 for the night including breakfast. She slept harder than she had in weeks. In the morning, she returned to the Thatcher Ranch to collect the bay gelding. She arrived at the stable and found Clement Thatcher already there, and the bay gelding already saddled and bridled and standing quietly at the rail, and beside it, also saddled and standing quietly, a tall buckskin stallion with a dark mane and the compact, powerful build of an animal bred for endurance over speed. She stopped. "I only asked to borrow one horse," she said. "I know," he said. He was tightening the cinch on the buckskin with efficient movements. "I saddled too." "I did not ask you to come with me." "No," he agreed. "I do not need an escort, Mr. Thatcher. I am capable of—" "I know you are capable," he said. "That is not what this is about." She looked at him. He looked at the cinch, adjusted it a final time, and then looked at her. "Sycamore Canyon in wet conditions is genuinely dangerous," he said. "There are also 3 men from the Holt Cattle Company who have been watching my property for the past 6 days, which suggests to me that someone is looking for something that came through Red Rock Junction recently. I do not know what that something is, and I am not asking, but I would like to see you safely through the canyon." It was the most words he had strung together since she met him. She stood in the early morning light with the horses breathing around her, and considered the offer and considered the man, and considered the fact that her survival instincts, which had served her well for 2 years, were not raising any particular alarm about him, which was either a good sign or a sign that she was exhausted to the point of poor judgment. "You have a ranch to run," she said. "The ranch will be here when I return," he said, though something in his face suggested that this was not entirely certain, and that he knew it was not entirely certain, and that he had decided to say it anyway. She got on the bay gelding. He got on the buckskin stallion. They rode west. For the first 2 hours, they said almost nothing. The road out of Red Rock Junction was a decent track that wound between low hills covered in scrub and ocotillo, and the morning was cool enough to be pleasant, and the horses moved at an easy pace that 8 miles without wearing anyone out. Theodora rode with the particular alert watchfulness she had developed over 2 years of traveling alone, scanning the terrain ahead and behind with casual regularity, and she noticed after a while that Clement Thatcher was doing exactly the same thing with an expertise that suggested the habit was very old. "You have ridden through here many times," she said. "Since I was a boy," he said. "My father used to take me west into the canyon country when I was very young. He called it education." "What did he do, your father?" Mrs. Peabody mentioned he was a federal man. A pause. "Federal investigator. He spent 20 years working out of the territorial capital. He is retired now because of his health. He lives in Flagstaff with my aunt." Another pause, shorter. "He did important work." "What kind of work?" "The kind that made certain powerful men very uncomfortable," Clement said, and then he looked at the horizon, and she understood that this thread of conversation had reached its natural end for now. They stopped to water the horses at a spring just before noon. The landscape had shifted from flat scrub to rolling red rock country, beautiful and indifferent, and the August heat had climbed to the kind of intensity that made the air itself appear to shimmer. They ate their midday meal in the shade of a sandstone overhang, the horses ground-hitched nearby, and Theodora found herself thinking about the leather satchel strapped to the back of her saddle, and whether she should say anything about what it contained, and deciding she should not yet. "How did you end up alone?" Clement asked. He was looking at the horizon again, not at her, which made the question easier somehow. "My parents died," she said, 2 years ago. "I am sorry." "My father first, then my mother. They came out here from Ohio 8 years ago with the same ideas everyone had about the territory. My father was a good man. He had terrible luck." She paused, testing how much to say. "He saw something he should not have seen, and afterward his luck got worse, and then it stopped altogether." Clement was quiet. He had that quality, she was beginning to notice, of being quiet in a way that invited further speech rather than closing it off. It was a rare quality in people in general, and rarer still in men she had encountered in the territory. "The men from the Holt Company," she said. "You mentioned they were watching your property." "For about a week." "3 riders. They do not come onto the land, but they are visible from the main road." "Holt has been pressuring you." Holt has been pressuring everyone in this county for 3 years. He uses water rights as a lever. He cuts off access to the springs and the river channels through legal maneuvers that are technically valid but built on fraudulent land grant documents. He said this with a controlled evenness that told her the evenness was deliberate, that under it there was something with considerable heat. 6 families have sold out to him under duress in the past 18 months. I have refused. He is patient. He will wait. And Marshal Vickers facilitates this, she said. The silence this time was of a different quality. She watched him process the fact that she had just named Vickers without prompting, watched him reassemble his understanding of who she was. "What do you know about Marshal Vickers?" he asked, very carefully. "Enough," she said. "Perhaps more than enough. That is why I need to reach Tucson." He looked at her then fully for a long moment, and she met his gaze and did not look away. The gray eyes were measuring her again, but differently now, not assessing whether she could survive the journey, but assessing something else entirely, something that had to do with stakes and hidden motives and the dark architecture of 2-year-old crimes. "Your father," he said finally, "he witnessed something. Yes, and he wrote it down. Yes, and you have it. Yes." Another silence, this one with the quality of something large settling into place. "Then you need to reach Tucson very much," he said. "I am aware of that, Mr. Thatcher." "Clement," he said. "My name is Clement." "Theodora," she said, "though you already know that." "Yes," he said, "I do." They broke camp and rode on, and the canyon country closed around them by mid-afternoon. The walls of red and orange stone rising to either side as the trail descended into the first of the canyon passages Clement had described. She could see why the warning had been necessary. The trail had narrowed to a ledge barely wide enough for 2 horses to pass abreast, and the stone beneath the horses' hooves was the color of rust, and showed clearly the glistening quality of rock still wet from last week's rain. Far below on the left side, the canyon floor was strewn with boulders the size of houses. Clement moved the buckskin to the inside of the trail, between her and the cliff face, without comment. It was not a gesture designed to call attention to itself. He simply repositioned his horse, and they continued. The maneuver put him closer to the wall and left her horse with the wider berth, and it meant that if the outer edge of the trail gave way, it was more likely to be under him than under her. She noticed this. She did not say anything about it, because saying anything would have made him self-conscious about a kindness he had offered without wanting acknowledgement for it. And she had come to understand in 2 years of accepting and refusing help that the best way to honor a quiet kindness was to accept it quietly. They emerged from the first canyon passage as the sun was beginning its long descent toward the western rim, and Clement called a halt at a wide flat area above the trail where a cluster of cottonwood trees indicated water. They made camp efficiently, dividing the tasks without discussion, she seeing to the fire while he saw to the horses, and then she cooked what could charitably be called a stew from dried beef and the wilted but serviceable vegetables from the provisions he had packed. And he took first watch and she slept, and she did not realize until she was already asleep that she had not slept without one ear perpetually open for danger in nearly 2 years. She woke in the gray pre-dawn to find him sitting by the banked fire with his back to her, the rifle across his knees, looking out at the dark canyon below. He had not woken her for her watch. She sat up and he turned at the sound of her moving. "You should have woken me," she said. "I was not tired," he said. "That is not the point." "What is the point?" "The point is that we had an arrangement and you unilaterally changed it." He considered this. "Fair enough," he said. "Tomorrow night I will wake you." She put water on to boil for coffee and watched him in the growing light, and tried to organize her thoughts about him into something useful. He was not a man who said unnecessary things or made unnecessary gestures. When he did something, it had a reason behind it, but the reason was never the reason you expected. He had saddled a second horse not to impose his company, but because he had assessed a danger she had not yet fully grasped. He had taken the inside of the canyon trail not to demonstrate protectiveness, but because it was the mathematically sensible thing to do. He had not woken her for her watch, not because he doubted her capability, but because he had not, in fact, been tired. She found this deeply unnerving in the way that genuinely honest people were unnerving to someone who had spent 2 years in the careful management of other people's potential motives. There was no hidden motive here that she could identify, and the absence of a hidden motive was so unusual that she kept looking for it. The second day's ride took them deeper into the canyon country, and then up a long switchback trail to a higher plateau that offered, once they crested it, a view of such extravagant beauty that she stopped her horse involuntarily. The plateau rolled away to the west in waves of red and gold stone, cut by the shadow lines of distant canyons, and beyond it the horizon was a smear of purple mountain ranges going blue with distance. "The superstitions," Clement said, reining in beside her and following her gaze. "And beyond them, eventually, Tucson." "I have never seen anything like this," she said. "Ohio was green?" he asked. There was something in his voice she had not heard before, a very slight softening. "Very green," she said. "And flat, and the sky was never this size." "I went east once," he said, "to St. Louis. I did not like the small sky." She laughed. She had not meant to. The laugh came out of her unprepared and surprised her by being genuine. He looked at her sideways with something in the gray eyes that might have been surprise as well. They rode on across the plateau, and the conversation deepened gradually over the hours, the way conversation deepened between people who were not trying to make it deepen, but who discovered that they were interested in the same questions. He asked her about Ohio, and she told him about the river and the cornfields and the 2-room school she had attended, and the town she had grown up in that smelled of wood smoke in autumn and river water all summer. She asked him about growing up in the territory, and he told her about riding the canyon country with his father, about learning to read terrain the way other children learn to read books, about the summer he was 14 when they had tracked a band of cattle thieves through 3 counties, and his father had used patience and observation rather than force, and had brought the matter to an entirely legal conclusion that had resulted in not a single shot fired. "Your father sounds like a remarkable man," she said. "He is," Clement said, and the present tense carried a weight in it she did not press against. By the end of the second day, she had stopped looking for hidden motives and had started, in spite of herself, simply experiencing his company, which was a strange and somewhat alarming sensation, because she had not done that with anyone in a very long time. It was on the morning of the third day, when they were already saddled and ready to leave camp, that Theodora remembered the saddlebag and went to check the oilcloth package containing her father's document, a habit she had maintained obsessively for months. The saddlebag was buckled. She opened it and saw the oilcloth package sitting exactly as she had left it. Beneath it, slightly displaced from where it might have been tucked by accident, was a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it with fingers that remained steady only by virtue of long practice, and she read the heading and Clement Thatcher's name and Marshall Vickers, and detained the Dawson woman at any cost. And she did not read any further because the canyon floor had come rushing up to meet her, and she had already drawn the gun. Now she stood in the stable yard of the Holloway Ranch, where they had arrived the previous evening, and the gun was lowered, and the second page of the letter was in her left hand, and the words W.T. looked up at her in the growing morning light, and she understood that she had nearly shot the one person in Maricopa County who was actually on her side. "Your father is William Thatcher," she said again, because she needed to hear it out loud. "The federal investigator. He has been building a case against Vickers." "For 4 years," Clement said. "Even after his retirement, even after his health made active investigation impossible. He has been coordinating from Flagstaff, routing information through contacts, building the case file. He wrote to me 8 months ago that a woman named Dawson had documents that could close the matter, and that she might eventually come through this area, and that if she did, I should help her without letting her know the full connection, because anyone who knew my father was attached to the case was a potential target. Theodora sat down heavily on a fence post. He did not know you would tell me. He knew I would have to, Clement said. Because I would not leave you alone with a half-read letter and no explanation, and because he stopped. Because, she said. He looked at her in the early morning light, standing in the dust of the stable yard with his hands at his sides, and she saw something in his face that was not the calculating steadiness she had come to expect, but something rawer and less managed. Because I have been riding with you for 3 days, and I believe every word you say, and I think you deserve the truth, he said. Which is different from detaining you, or using you, or any of the other things the people in your recent life have apparently done. She looked at him for a very long time. The horses shifted. The rooster crowed again from somewhere behind the Holloway barn. The sun came up another degree and painted the red rock of the valley wall a deeper orange. I almost shot you, she said. I noticed. I was not bluffing. I know, he said. You are not the bluffing kind. You were not afraid. I was afraid, he said simply. I was simply not going to let that be visible because visible fear in that situation would have been unhelpful. Something cracked open in the very carefully maintained structure of her chest. She put the gun back in its holster with precise, deliberate movements. She smoothed the letter's second page with her thumb and looked at the signature again. How ill is your father? She asked. Seriously, Clement said. He has been ill for a 1.5 years. He will likely not see another winter. He said this with the flatness of a man who had already done the grief of it many times and was now simply living alongside the fact. He wants to see this case closed before he dies. He has worked his whole life to bring men like Vickers to account, and Conrad Holt is the worst of the breed he has seen in 40 years of federal work. Then we need to move, Theodora said, and she stood up from the fence post. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, and she realized with a small, strange shock that he was moved by this, by her quick and uncomplicated decision to continue after everything that had just happened. We need to move, he agreed. They said their brief farewells to Agnes Holloway, who had been graciously incurious about their business and was the kind of woman who fed people well and asked no questions, and they rode west again before the heat had fully built. The third day on the road was different from the first 2, in a way that was difficult to describe and easy to feel. The near catastrophe of the morning had burned through some barrier between them, the way a fire cleared underbrush to reveal the terrain beneath. They talked differently now, with less careful management on her part and less careful restraint on his, and what emerged was a conversation that ranged across 20 different subjects and kept returning, with a pull like water finding its level, to the same central territory. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 11 of a fever that swept through the valley the year before the army surgeon arrived in the county. He told her about the summer after his mother died when his father, who was not a demonstrative man, had taken him out of school for 3 months and traveled the territory with him, not explaining the journey or its purpose, just riding and camping and working, and being present in a way that Clement had understood only years later was his father's way of grieving and of ensuring that his son understood the land they came from. She told him about the last year of her parents' lives, which she had not spoken of to anyone since Apache Wells. She told him about her father's fear and her mother's stubborn, quiet courage, and the night she had found her father burning papers and had argued with him until dawn about whether to run, and how running had seemed like surrender, and how in the end the choice had been taken from them. She told him about the 2 years of after, the moving and the silence and the accumulated weight of carrying her father's document, and knowing what it meant and not knowing how to deploy it safely. You have been alone with this for 2 years, he said. Yes, that is a long time to carry something that heavy. People carry things, she said. It is what people do. Yes, he said. But they do not have to do it alone. The sentence sat in the air between them with a weight it had not had the day before, and she looked at him and he looked at the trail, and the horses walked steadily west. That night they camped on the near side of the second canyon section, which was the more difficult one, Clement said, and better attempted in morning light. They built the fire larger than on previous nights, because the air at this elevation had a genuine autumn edge to it despite the month, and after they ate she looked up at the stars, which in this country were not the cautious sprinkling she remembered from Ohio but a wholesale overflow, white on black, the Milky Way laid across the sky like something spilled with extravagant carelessness. "I will never stop being startled by the sky here," she said. "My mother used to say that the sky in the territory was God showing off," he said. She laughed again. "She sounds like she was wonderful." "She was," he said. He was lying back against his saddle with his hat tipped up, looking at the sky with the ease of a man completely comfortable in this landscape. "She would have liked you." The sentence came out with an absence of calculation that told her he had not planned to say it, and in the brief silence that followed she heard him acknowledge that he had said it without immediately retreating from it. "Why?" she asked. "She valued people who did not make excuses," he said, "who faced what was in front of them. She was that way herself. I do not meet many people who have it. You have it extremely thoroughly." Theodora looked at the stars and felt the warmth of that crawl through her in a way she had not expected to feel again for a very long time. "Clement," she said, "yes. When this is over, when I have delivered the documents and given my testimony, what happens then?" She was not asking about him. She was asking about herself, about the shape of the life that waited on the other side of Tucson, and she realized even as she said it that the question had arrived with unexpected urgency, because until recently she had not been able to think about a life on the other side. There had only been the document and the testimony and the grand jury and the obligation to her father's memory. "I expect you will need to decide where you want to be," he said. "I have not had a place in 2 years." "I know," he said. "That seems like something that should change." "Yes," she said, "it does." The second canyon passage the following morning was everything Clement had described and more. The trail reduced to a true ledge, not wide enough for 2 horses abreast, and the rock face sheared away on the outer side into a drop she refused to estimate precisely because the estimation would not be useful. The buckskin moved across it with the careful deliberation of a trained animal, and the bay matched its rhythm without prompting, and Clement led and she followed, and at the narrowest point, where the ledge bent around an outcropping and you could not see what was ahead, he called back, "6 more feet and it opens up," and she said, "All right," with a steadiness she was genuinely proud of. When the ledge broadened and became a proper trail again, she let out the breath she had been holding for the last quarter mile and found that her hands were shaking slightly on the reins. Clement waited for her to come alongside. He looked at her. "All right?" he asked. "Completely," she said. "You are shaking." "The shaking is merely a physiological response to adrenaline. It is not indicative of anything." "No," he agreed, "it is not." He looked at her a moment longer with those steady gray eyes, and then he said, "For what it is worth, that section concerns me as well, every time." "Good," she said. "It should." He almost smiled. She had come to notice that he almost smiled rather than fully smiled, and that each almost smile was its own specific thing, calibrated to the specific situation that had produced it, and they were more communicative than the full smiles of people who smiled readily. 4 days outside Tucson, they rode into the small town of Oracle for supplies and to rest the horses. Oracle was a modest mining settlement in the Santa Catalina mountain foothills, cooler than the desert below, with a decent store and a livery, and a 2-room inn called the Mountain Rest that was run by a Mexican family named Celia who served beans and roasted chili peppers and fresh tortillas and strong coffee. It was at the Oracle livery, while Clement was arranging care for the horses, that Theodora saw the rider come in from the East Road. She knew him. Not personally, but she had seen him before in Apache Wells in the days when she was ill and barely coherent but still cataloging threats by habit. He had been in the boarding house yard, watching the building, a rider for the Holt Company. She walked to the livery with the measured pace of someone who was not alarmed. "We have company," she said low to Clement's back. He did not turn immediately. He spoke one more quiet word to the liveryman, then turned and walked with her to the stable's side door, and she described the rider and where she had seen him before, and Clement's face did the thing where it became very still. "How certain are you?" he asked. "Completely certain. He has a distinctive scar on his left jaw, an old burn, and he rides with his left stirrup shorter than his right because of a leg injury. Both details are the same." "That means they tracked your movements further back than I thought," he said. "Which means they may have someone in Oracle who can send word ahead to Tucson." He thought for a moment. "We leave tonight. Not in the morning tonight, and we take the back road through the San Pedro Valley rather than the direct Tucson road." "The back road adds 2 days." "Yes, but the direct road can be watched. The San Pedro route is harder going but less predictable," she agreed. They ate their meal at the Celia family's table with the careful casualness of people who were simply tired travelers, and Senora Celia poured their coffee and asked where they were headed, and Clement said east, toward the Rincon Mountains, with the plausible ease of a man who had told partial truths before in conditions requiring it. They left Oracle at midnight. The moon was 3/4 full, and the mountain road was navigable, and the horses moved through the cool night air with the comfortable energy of animals well rested. Theodora rode with the satchel across her back instead of on the saddle, because it was within reach that way, and the weight of it against her spine was a kind of reassurance. The San Pedro Valley route was indeed harder going. The first day involved a creek crossing that was higher than Clement had expected, the summer monsoon having filled the arroyos beyond their usual August levels, and the crossing cost them an hour of careful navigation, and left them both wet to the knee and the horses blowing. But the country was empty of other travelers, and the trail, such as it was, showed no fresh sign of other riders. "Do you think we lost them?" she asked, after the 3rd hour without sign. "Possibly," he said, "or possibly they know where we are going and are waiting rather than following." "Your father," she said carefully. "He coordinated with someone in Tucson, the federal investigator, Reed. Thomas Reed, yes, he is legitimate. My father vouched for him personally." A pause. "My father does not personally vouch for people lightly." "What will Reed do with the documents?" "Present them to the grand jury panel." "Your testimony is also required. The oral account of what your father told you directly in the days before his death. The written document is the primary evidence, but your testimony corroborates the chain of custody and establishes the context." He looked at her. "You have been over this in your mind many times. Every day for 2 months," she said. "You are prepared." "I am terrified," she said, "and prepared, both are true." "They always are," he said. "The fear is appropriate. It does not mean you will fail." "My father failed," she said. "The sentence arrived raw, the way things arrived when they came from very deep." He did not respond immediately, and she appreciated that, because the quick reassurances that people offered at moments like this were a kindness aimed at themselves rather than at the person who needed it. "Your father did not fail," he said finally. "He was killed. Those are different things. He did everything right. The system around him failed. The people who should have protected what he saw failed. He did not." She pressed her lips together and looked at the trail ahead. "He would have liked you," she said after a moment, "for saying that." "I mean it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why he would have liked you." They rode in comfortable silence for the better part of an hour, which was a different thing from riding in strained silence, and she reflected on how seldom she had experienced the comfortable variety in the past 2 years, and how naturally it seemed to exist between the two of them. On the second night in the San Pedro Valley, the thunderstorm arrived from the southwest without much warning, the way summer monsoon storms did in the territory, building from a darkening quarter of sky to a full electrical assault in the space of 40 minutes. They made camp under a sandstone overhang barely large enough for both horses and both people, and sat pressed back against the rock, while the lightning lit the valley in strobing white-purple light, and the rain came down in the specific biblical manner of Arizona monsoon rain, not individual drops but solid curtains of water that hit the earth with an audible impact. They were very close together under the overhang because the overhang was not large. The horses were solid and calm, trained well, and they blocked most of the wind, and the warmth of the animals was genuinely welcome because the storm had brought a cold front with it. In Ohio, she said, watching the lightning, the thunderstorms were quieter than this. Everything here is louder, he said. The storms, the silence, the heat, the cold. He paused. I have been trying to imagine Ohio based on what you have told me. I cannot do it. The green and the flat and the small sky, it does not form a picture. I will tell you more, she said. What do you want to know? Tell me about one specific day from when you were happy, he said. The request was so simple and so direct that she felt it like a hand placed briefly on her shoulder. She thought about it honestly, sifting through the years before the territory, before the fear. My mother used to take me to the river in September, she said. There was a place on the Scioto River where the bank was flat and wide, and the willows came down to the water. She would bring a basket with bread and cheese and apple butter, and we would sit on the bank all afternoon. She would read and I would wade in the shallows and look for crayfish. The water was cold even in September. The light in the willows was green gold. Nothing was required of us. She paused. I have not thought about that day in a long time. It sounds like it belonged to you, he said, the kind of memory that is completely yours. Yes, she said, exactly that. Hold it, he said. The things that belong to you completely are the ones that cannot be taken, no matter what else happens. She looked at his profile in the lightning-lit dark. He was looking at the rain, and in the brief flashes she could see his face with unusual clarity, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that she was coming to read as the physical expression of his thinking, the quiet steadiness that was so habitual to him it seemed almost structural. What day would you choose, she asked, if I asked you the same question? He was quiet for a moment. A day when I was about 13, he said. My father and I were camped on the rim of the Grand Canyon, one of those tributary canyons in the north. Dawn. The fog was filling the canyon below us, and the top of the fog was level with the rim, and the sun was just starting to light the upper walls, and I looked out and it was exactly as though the earth had a second sky underneath it. A white sky below and a pink sky above, and the two of us sitting between them. A very brief silence. I thought then that the world was stranger and more generous than I had been told, that there were gifts in it that I had not been prepared for. That is beautiful, she said. Yes, he said, it was, and then quieter, you remind me of it sometimes. The lightning flashed. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the rain came down outside the overhang, and the horses stood warm and patient in the dark, and something that had been carefully and necessarily sealed for 2 years opened in her chest like a window onto the air. She did not say anything. Neither did he. But she moved the very smallest amount closer on the cold rock, and he did not move away. And the storm raged through the canyon, while the two of them sat in their small, dry pocket of the universe, and let the silence be what it was. They reached the outskirts of Tucson 3 days later, on the 8th day after leaving Red Rock Junction, arriving at dusk through the Santa Cruz River bottomlands on the south approach. The mission church of San Xavier del back white and golden in the last of the light, the city spreading out on its desert plain ahead of them with the particular purposeful chaos of a territorial capital that was also a very old place. Tucson in 1882 was a city of considerable complexity. The ancient Presidio overlaid now with American streets and American commerce, the two cultures in a constant process of negotiation that was sometimes graceful and sometimes not. Congress Street was lively with gas-lit establishments, and the smell of the city after the open desert was an assault, horses and wood smoke and food, and the particular sweetrot smell of a place where many people lived close together. After 8 days of canyon and mesa and empty sky, It was disorienting in the way of things that were once familiar and had been forgotten. Thomas Reed met them at the federal offices on Pennington Street, a tall man in his mid-40s with a neat dark beard and the watchful, somewhat exhausted look of a man who had been working the same problem from many angles for a long time. He greeted Clement with the warmth of someone who knew the family well, and he greeted Theodora with a formal respect that told her he understood what she had been carrying and what it had cost. "The grand jury convenes in 4 days," he said, ushering them into a back room that had the feel of a place where important and secret things had been discussed many times. "We will need your full statement tomorrow, Theodora, and the document the day after for certification. The timing is narrow, but it is viable." "Who else knows we are here?" Clement asked. "Only the people in this office and Judge Haverford, who is running the proceeding. We have been careful." Reed looked at Theodora. "You should know that Marshal Vickers has formally denied all charges preemptively, which tells us someone informed him the case is near conclusion. There may be pressure applied in the next 4 days. You should remain here in the federal building until the hearing." "She will be safe," Clement said. Reed looked at him. "Are you staying?" Clement looked at Theodora. "Yes," she said, meeting his eyes. "He is staying." Something moved across Clement's face that was not an almost smile this time, but a different thing altogether. Something fuller and less guarded, and he nodded once. That night they were given rooms in the federal building, small and clean, and Theodora sat on the edge of her bed with her father's document unwrapped from the oilcloth and laid on the blanket in front of her. She read through it one final time, in the careful handwriting of a man who had wanted to be believed and had tried very hard to be clear. He had been thorough. Dates, amounts, names, locations. The exchange had occurred at Vickers's office, not even clandestine, which told you something about how confident these men had been in their impunity. $12,000. Water rights to 1,700 acres of prime grassland. The signatures of both men on a document that Holt had apparently believed would remain private forever. She pressed her palm flat on the page. "Papa," she said very quietly to the room, "I am here. I am going to finish it." She folded the document back into the oilcloth and wrapped it carefully. Then she sat in the dark room and felt the 8 days of travel settle into her bones, and the awareness that what she had been moving toward for 2 years was now only days away. There was a knock at her door. She opened it and found Clement in the corridor with 2 cups of coffee, which was such an unexpectedly mundane gesture that she almost laughed. "I did not know if you would sleep," he said. "No," she said, "not yet." He offered a cup and she took it, and they stood in the doorway of her room drinking the coffee, which was strong and slightly burned and absolutely welcome. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Of the testimony itself, not of the outcome." "Because of what you will have to say." "Because I will have to say it in front of people and in a formal setting, and I will have to remain controlled through the parts that are not easy to say with control." She paused. "I have not talked about my parents' deaths formally, in a public way, only to you." "You have talked about it to me very well," he said. "You will do the same in the courtroom. You are not an impartial audience." "No," he said, "I am not." He said it simply, without turning it into a moment, and she took a careful breath. "Clement," she said, "yes. When we are through this, when the testimony is done and the case is closed and it is over." She stopped. She was not accustomed to saying what she was about to say. She was not sure she had ever said anything like it. "I would like to not go back to being alone." The corridor was quiet around them. Somewhere in the building a door closed. The gas lamp on the wall made a small, steady sound. "I would like that as well," he said, and his voice carried something in it she had not heard before, a vulnerability held out like something being offered with full knowledge of the risk of offering it. "Very much." She looked at him for a long time. Then she set her coffee cup on the floor beside the door, and she took one step toward him, and she kissed him briefly and cleanly on the corner of his mouth, and then she stepped back. He stood very still. "Good night, Clement," she said. "Good night, Theodora," he said, and his voice was somewhat less controlled than usual, and she found that deeply, specifically satisfying. She slept. The testimony took 2 days. On the first day, she gave her formal statement to Thomas Reed and 2 other federal officers, a process that was precise and exhausting, the kind of exhaustion that came from speaking the absolute truth with absolute clarity and not allowing the emotion to overwhelm the structure. She described her father's account as he had related to her: the location, the date, the amounts, the names, the document he had witnessed being signed, the subsequent events, the accident that was not an accident. She spoke clearly. She did not cry, though the effort of not crying over certain passages was its own kind of labor. On the second day, the document was presented and certified by 3 handwriting experts who confirmed Jeremiah Dawson's authorship. Reed took both pieces of evidence before the grand jury. Theodora was not present in the jury room but sat in the anteroom with her hands folded in her lap and Clement sitting beside her, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his presence as a steady warmth. They waited for 2 hours. When Reed came out, he was smiling. The smile of a man who had worked 4 years for something and was seeing it arrive. "The grand jury has returned an indictment," he said, "against Marshall Dale Vickers and Conrad Holt on charges of bribery, fraud, conspiracy to obstruct federal law, and complicity in the death of Jeremiah Dawson." He said the last one looking directly at Theodora. "Your father's death will be formally re-examined as a homicide. There will be an arrest warrant issued before the end of the week. Vickers and Holt will be taken into custody by federal marshals from outside the territory, which means their own people cannot interfere." Theodora stood up slowly from her chair. "It will hold?" she asked. "The evidence is sufficient." "The evidence is more than sufficient," Reed said. "Your father was very thorough, and you were very brave." She stood in the federal corridor and felt something she had been carrying for 2 years begin, very slowly, to lighten. Not disappear. It would not disappear. Her parents were gone and the world did not correct those losses. But the injustice, the particular unbearable quality of the injustice, the fact that men who had destroyed a good man's life had continued to walk freely in the sunshine, that was ending. Clement's hand found hers in the corridor. She had not seen him reach for it. But there it was, his hand around hers, warm and steady and certain, and she held it without letting go. They sent a telegraph to William Thatcher in Flagstaff that evening. The message was short because telegraph messages were by necessity short, but Reed helped compose it so that it said everything in few words. "Indictment returned. Case complete. Your work and your son's work made this possible. WT, your work in this world has been done with honor." William Thatcher's reply came the following morning. It read, "Tell Clement to come home and bring her with you." She read the message twice and looked at Clement, who was reading over her shoulder, and whose face was doing the thing where it was still but not empty, where the stillness was the container for something that needed a container. "Your father is a confident man," she said. "He is a very perceptive man," Clement said. "He has not even met me." "He read your father's document," Clement said. "He told me 4 months ago that whoever was carrying that document was someone of considerable character. He said, and I am quoting precisely, that courage of that caliber was not accidental and was generally inherited." He paused. "He asked me to write and describe you after you first arrived in Reed Rock Junction. You wrote about me to your father. I wrote to him that you were the most self-possessed woman I had ever encountered, and that you were riding alone across canyon country with maps that were inadequate and supplies that were insufficient, and that you had agreed to every correction to your provisioning list without argument or pride, which told me you were the kind of person who prioritized outcomes over appearances." A pause. "And that you had very fine eyes." Theodora Dawson looked at Clement Thatcher in the morning light of the Tucson federal office and felt something that was entirely new and entirely right settle into place in the center of her chest. "You noticed my eyes," she said. "I noticed everything about you," he said very quietly. "From the first moment you walked onto my property." She stepped forward, and this time when she kissed him it was not brief and it was not at the corner of his mouth, and his hand came up to her face with a gentleness that was, she thought, characteristic, because everything he did was deliberate, and everything deliberate in him had this quality of care that ran deeper than habit. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead briefly against his collarbone, and he put his hand on the back of her head, and neither of them said anything at all for a long, excellent moment. They rode north to Flagstaff together, which added 5 days to the journey, but which felt like an entirely different kind of travel than the urgent, danger-shadowed run to Tucson. The weather held fine. The country between Tucson and Flagstaff rolled through desert and woodland and high pine forest, and the temperature dropped steadily as they climbed elevation. And by the time the San Francisco peaks came into view on the northern horizon, white-capped even in August, the air smelled of pine resin and high altitude and possibility. They talked without the weight of danger over them, and the conversation moved easily from the serious to the light and back again. She learned that he had once tried to read law from books at the age of 17 and abandoned it after a season, that he could cook competently, but found it unrewarding compared to the dozen other things he could do with his time, that he had a younger sister who had married a schoolteacher in Phoenix and had 3 children and wrote letters every 2 weeks with a dedicated regularity that he found both touching and somewhat overwhelming. She told him about her ambition to teach properly, not in the makeshift schoolroom she had operated in for survival money, but in a real school with books and a blackboard, and enough time to do the work correctly. She told him about the books she missed from her parents' house, a small library of Ohio classics that had been sold when the ranch went to pay debts, and she still felt the absence of specific titles the way one felt the absence of specific people. "You should have a library," he said. "Yes," she said, "I should. The ranch house has a room that is currently used for storage that would make a reasonable library if someone were willing to undertake the project." She looked at him sideways in the afternoon pine-filtered light. He was looking at the trail ahead with the focused expression of a man who had just said something that sounded offhand but was not. "Is that an invitation?" She asked. "That is whatever you want it to be," he said. "I am not a man who puts conditions on things." "What would you want it to be?" she asked. He turned and looked at her directly. "I would want it to be permanent," he said. "I would want you to have a home with books and a garden if you want one and all the rest of the permanence that people deserve." A pause. "I would want to be part of that permanence if you are willing." The pines moved in the high wind above them and the horses walked and the peaks stood blue-white on the horizon. "Ask me properly then," she said. "Theodora Dawson," he said, with a gravity that was entirely sincere and a slight trace of the almost smile at the very edge of it, "will you do me the honor of staying? On the condition that you have your own opinion about everything, your own work in the world, and as many books as the ranch house can structurally support." "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "On all those conditions." He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand, and they rode the last 3 miles into Flagstaff holding hands like the 2 sensible and thoroughly decided people that they were. William Thatcher was a man diminished by illness, but in no way diminished in presence. He was propped in a chair in his sister's front parlor when they arrived, a thin man in his late 60s with eyes the same shade of gray as his son's, and the papery look of someone whose body was failing ahead of their will. He looked at Theodora when Clement brought her in, and his examination was thorough and direct and lasted the better part of 30 seconds. "Jeremiah Dawson's daughter," he said. His voice was still strong even if the rest of him was not. "Yes, sir," she said. "Your father was a brave man. He should not have died as he did. I am sorry that I could not move faster." "You moved as fast as the work allowed," she said, "and you moved it to completion." He would have been grateful. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair beside him. "Tell me about him, not about what he witnessed. Tell me about who he was." And she sat beside the old investigator in the quiet parlor, and she told him about her father, the whole man. the Ohio farmer who had tried to transplant himself to desert country with more optimism than resources, who had sung badly and cooked surprisingly well, and told the same 3 jokes with unwavering enthusiasm, and had believed with a thoroughness that bordered on the theological, that honesty was not merely a virtue but a structural necessity of the world. She told him about her father's hands, which were always working some small task, mending a harness or sharpening a tool, because he could not sit entirely still without something to do. She told him about her father's laugh. William Thatcher listened with the attention of a man who had spent 40 years listening for the truth in things people said, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "That is the man I read in those documents. I am glad to know he was also that." He looked at his son, who had been standing in the doorway of the parlor through the whole of this, and something passed between them that needed no words. "You did well, Clement." "I had good help," Clement said, and looked at Theodora. William Thatcher spent 6 more weeks in the world. He died in late September of that year in the early morning in his sister's house in Flagstaff, with his son beside him. Clement had been with him for the last 10 days, sleeping in the guest room and spending the daylight hours in conversation with his father, the 2 of them talking through things that had always been true between them, but perhaps had not been spoken aloud with the full weight they deserved. Theodora had stayed at the ranch in Red Rock Junction during those 10 days, not because she had been sent away, but because it felt right to give those final days to father and son without outside presence. She had spent the time reorganizing the storage room into the beginnings of a library, ordering books by post, cleaning and painting, and setting in order the domestic architecture of the ranch house with the thorough, purposeful energy of someone investing in a future they believed in. When Clement returned from Flagstaff, he was quieter than usual, and the grief on him was the honest kind that asked nothing of anyone. She met him at the gate of the property and walked with him to the house and made coffee and set food in front of him, and he ate without much appetite, and she did not try to fix the grief with words, because she knew better than anyone that grief did not want to be fixed. It wanted to be witnessed. That evening they sat on the porch of the ranch house in the September dark, and she put her hand on top of his, and he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, and they sat for a long time watching the stars come out over the valley. "He was content at the end," Clement said. "He told me he was satisfied that his work had come to something real. He said the world was more orderly than when he had found it, and a man could not ask more than that." "He was right," she said. "He asked me if I was happy," Clement said. "I told him I was becoming so. And what did he say to that? He said that becoming was the only honest version of the word." A pause. "He liked you extremely." "I liked him," she said, "extremely." Clement lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, briefly, and she felt the warmth of it travel all the way up her arm. Marshal Dale Vickers was arrested in October 1882 by 4 federal marshals from the New Mexico Territory who arrived in Prescott without advance notice. He was taken to Tucson for trial. Conrad Holt attempted to flee to Mexico and was apprehended at the border crossing near Nogales. Both men stood trial the following spring before a federal judge appointed from outside the territory specifically to ensure no local entanglement. The trial lasted 12 days. Both were convicted on multiple counts. Vickers received 15 years in the federal penitentiary. Holt received 12 years and forfeited all land acquired through fraudulent documents, which meant that 17 families in Maricopa and Yavapai counties recovered their water rights and their grazing access. Theodora did not attend the trial. She had given what she had to give, her father's document and her testimony before the grand jury, and she had no interest in watching the mechanics of punishment. What she had wanted was not punishment but correction. The world adjusted back toward honest, and that was occurring, and it was enough. She married Clement Thatcher in November of 1882 in the parlor of the Holloway Ranch, officiated by the Episcopal minister, who visited Redrock Junction every third Sunday, with Agnes Holloway and her 3 sons as witnesses and Mrs. Peabody from the general store in attendance and contributing an alarmingly large quantity of food to the celebration afterward. The ceremony was brief and they wrote their own words, because both of them were precise about language and had decided that the standard words, while fine, were not quite the words they meant to say. Clement said, "I promise to saddle the second horse, to go where you go in the conditions you face, not the conditions I would prefer, to make space for what you know and what you carry, to be steady when things are not steady and to ask your help when I am not." Theodora said, "I promise to stop looking for the hidden motive, to accept the kindness that is offered without requiring it to explain itself, to make this place a home and this life a shared one, not a parallel one, to read you the best sentences from every book I acquire, even when you are trying to sleep." Agnes Holloway cried. Mrs. Peabody appeared unmoved but later admitted to the minister that it was the finest set of vows she had ever heard, which for Mrs. Peabody was extraordinary praise. The ranch in the years that followed recovered its health steadily. With the water rights restored throughout the county, the Thatcher Cattle Company expanded again, not to its former size, but to a sustainable one that Clement managed with the same methodical care he brought to everything. They hired 2 hands, brothers from a Tohono O'odham family named Joaquin, who knew the land with the thorough intimacy of people whose family had been on it for centuries, and who proved invaluable in ways that went beyond any specific job description. Theodora opened a school. Not in Redrock Junction proper, which already had a school of limited scope in the church basement, but in a building she and Clement constructed specifically for the purpose on the east edge of the ranch property, where families from the surrounding ranches could reach it without the full trip into town. She had 12 students in the first year, ranging from 6 to 14, and she taught them reading and writing and arithmetic and geography, and whatever else seemed pressing, with a directness and a high expectation that the children responded to with the reliable intensity of young people who had never before been taken seriously. The library grew. It lined 2 walls of the room that had been storage, and it spilled over into the hallway, and Clement built a second set of shelves in the winter of their first year, with the slightly resigned expression of a man who had not fully calibrated the scope of his agreement to support unlimited books, but who remained fully committed to the principle. He read the books she put in front of him with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and he was, she discovered, an excellent reader, the kind who engaged with ideas rather than simply processed them, and who came to dinner wanting to talk about what he had read with a thoroughness that frequently ran past dessert and into the dark hours of the evening. Their first child was born in the autumn of 1883, a boy they named James William Thatcher, James for Theodora's father and William for Clement's. He was a large and opinionated baby with the gray Thatcher eyes and what appeared to be a philosophical objection to sleeping at predictable hours. Clement held him with the careful thoroughness he brought to all important tasks and looked at him with an expression Theodora had never seen on his face before and filed away among the things she intended to keep. Their son grew into a curious, energetic child who spent as much time in his mother's schoolroom as on the ranch, and combined the 2 inheritances so naturally that it never occurred to him they were separate things. Their second child came 2 years later, a girl they named Eleanor Alice Thatcher, Eleanor for Theodora's mother. She was quieter than her brother from the first week, watching the world with enormous dark eyes that took in everything and gave away nothing, which her parents recognized with some amusement. "She has your quality," Clement said, looking at his daughter in Theodora's arms in the lamplight of the bedroom. "Which quality?" Theodora asked. "The one where she is assessing everything and you cannot tell what conclusion she is drawing." He tilted his head, studying the baby. "I expect she will be formidable." "I expect she will be herself," Theodora said, "which is better than formidable." By 1887, the school had expanded to 18 students and Theodora had trained a second teacher, a young woman named Maria Fuentes who had grown up in Tucson and had come north looking for exactly this kind of work. And the two of them built a curriculum together that served the varied needs of a student body, composed of the children of Anglo ranchers, Mexican vaquero families, and 2 children from a Yavapai family who had settled near the valley's eastern edge. It was not a perfect school. There were limits of resources and of understanding that Theodora pushed against constantly and resolved where she could and documented where she could not. But it was a real school and it did real work, and she came home from it most evenings tired in the satisfying way of work that mattered. Thomas Reed came through Red Rock Junction in the spring of 1887, making a broader circuit of the territory in connection with his ongoing federal work, and had supper with Clement and Theodora at the ranch house. He was older and looked it, but he had the same watchful energy, and he talked about the territory's political evolution with the informed realism of someone who loved the place without romanticizing it. The vicar's case changed things, he said, over Theodora's chicken and green chili stew. Not everything, and not permanently by itself. But it demonstrated that the system could function, that there was accountability possible if people were willing to pursue it. That matters. It matters that your father's document exists and that you brought it forward, Theodora. It set something in motion that is still moving. My father wanted the world more orderly, she said. That was his word for it. Then he would be satisfied, Reed said. After Reed had gone, Clement and Theodora sat on the porch in the April evening, which was cool and smell of rain somewhere to the north over the plateau country. The children were inside, James working on a geography lesson with the intensity he always brought to maps, Alina having fallen asleep in the chair next to her brother with a book open on her chest, both of them entirely characteristic. "Are you satisfied?" Clement asked her. She considered the question honestly, as she considered all questions. The valley spread before them in the dusk, the red walls of the canyon country darkening to the color of old wine, the grasses of the recovered pastures moving in the evening wind, the school building visible to the east as a square of warm yellow lamplight because Maria Fuentes kept late hours. Behind her in the house were her children and her books, and the people and objects that constituted the life she had built out of the raw materials of survival and love. Beside her was the man who had saddled a second horse without being asked and ridden into uncertain danger to see her safely through it. She thought about her father, who had believed in honesty as a structural necessity of the world. She thought about her mother on the riverbank in the green light of Ohio September. She thought about a corridor in a federal building in Tucson and a cup of coffee offered without fuss, and a man who had said he would want permanence if she was willing. She had been willing. She was still willing. She was more willing every day, which was the only honest version of the word. "Yes," she said, "I am satisfied," and then because she was precise about language and because the word was right and grateful and entirely, completely here. He reached for her hand on the porch rail. She gave it to him. They sat in the evening of the Arizona territory and watched the stars come out over the canyon country, one by one and then all at once, the way they always did, extravagant and uncountable and absolutely certain. A third child came the following year, a boy they named Jeremiah Reed Thatcher, the middle name a quiet acknowledgement of the network of courage and persistence that had made their lives possible. He was a red-headed, laughing, entirely unbothered child from the first, the kind of person who moved through the world with a baffling serenity that everyone around him found either deeply calming or deeply suspicious, depending on their temperament. He would grow up to want to be a doctor, an ambition his parents supported without hesitation, and funded with something that left the ranch accounts temporarily thin, but which both of them considered the most straightforward expenditure they had ever made. James grew tall and became a surveyor, traveling the territory with the same love of terrain his grandfather had passed to his father, making maps that were, unlike the ones his mother had carried into the canyon country, entirely adequate. Eleanor became the kind of teacher her mother had always meant to be, establishing a school in Prescott of all places, the territorial capital where Vickers had once held court, and teaching there for 30 years with the implacable dedication and the assessing dark eyes that her father had recognized in her first week of life. The ranch remained. The school remained. The library grew past all architectural reason and eventually annexed the room next to it, which Clement surrendered without complaint though not without commentary, because he had developed, over the years, a dry and specific sense of humor about the books that was one of Theodora's favorite things in their shared life. On an evening in October of 1895, Theodora Dawson Thatcher stood in the doorway of the library she had built in what had been a storage room in a working ranch in the Arizona Territory, looked at the shelves from floor to ceiling, and the well-worn chairs, and the lamp burning on the writing table, and felt the fullness of a life that had been built from a very damaged starting point through the particular combination of her own refusal to be diminished and the presence of a man who had understood. Before she fully did, that the kindest thing he could do was simply to be ready. He came in behind her. He had a cup of coffee in each hand because some things were very consistent. "The Joaquin brothers found the missing heifer," he said. "She was in the north pasture, perfectly well, eating with particular satisfaction what appears to have been Agnes Holloway's vegetable garden." "Agnes will be furious," Theodora said. "Agnes was laughing when I left her," he said. He handed her a cup. She took it and turned to look at him, this man who had crossed 13 years and 3 children, and recovered water rights and a legal reckoning and the death of a father and the birth of a school and 600 miles of canyon country with her. His hair had a thread or two of gray at the temple now. The lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened. He looked at her the same way he always had, with the steady, careful, accurate attention of someone for whom she was not ordinary. "Clement," she said. "Theodora," he said, "I am glad you saddled the second horse." "I know," he said. "I am also glad." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then her mouth, then rested his forehead against hers in the lamplight of the room full of books. "I would saddle it again, every time, for the rest of my life." "I know that too," she said. Outside, the Arizona night was enormous and full of stars, the sky doing what the sky in this country always did, which was exactly what Clement's mother had said it did, showing off, making the world larger than expected, offering gifts that no one had been adequately prepared to receive. They drank their coffee. The lamp burned. The valley lay quiet and recovered in theirs around the house where they had built what they had built, and the story of it, which had begun with a horse asked and 2 saddled, went on in the way that good stories went on, not ending so much as deepening, becoming more fully itself with every year, rooted in red rock and high sky, and the particular, abiding, chosen love of 2 people who had found each other on the rim of a canyon and decided together to go forward.